We've heard the story 100 times before. Welfare doesn't work, welfare encourages laziness, welfare costs too much money. But what really is the meaningful alternative? Often, when we hear stories about welfare recipients, the underlying assumption is that these people take welfare services because they don't want to get a job. But is that really the case? Economists often differentiate between three major forms of unemployment. Seasonal, which is largely the product of the agricultural sector and tourism. Frictional, which is the natural product of people moving around and needing to find new jobs. And structural unemployment, a situation in which there aren't enough jobs to go around. This is a scenario that's most familiar with many of the deindustrialized areas of the former Rust Belt, but it should really be forcing us to ask a lot more fundamental questions about the modern economy. Let's start with one. Why can't we all have a job? It's this crucial question, and some of the important thinking behind it, that will be the subject of today's The Delta. The first is John Maynard Keynes, considered by many to be the founder of modern macroeconomics. The second is Michel Kalecki, a disciple of both Keynes and Marx. Now, Keynes' most influential work in the subject of macroeconomics, considered by some to have founded the modern discipline, is also one that takes as its very point of departure the subject of structural unemployment. That work, first published in 1936, is known as the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. In this work, Keynes argues that the general theory is differentiated from the specific theories, specifically of his predecessors, most famously the British economists David Ricardo and Adam Smith, in that the general theory does not assume full employment. In Keynes' general theory, he's keen to point out how, in distinction from the classical economists he's criticizing, his own theory does not assume that the given level of investment in the economy is going to be sufficient in order to produce full employment. You see, in Keynes' system, the given level of investment in the economy determines employment and therefore consumption. As a result of this, if the level of investment that individual entrepreneurs and capitalists are putting into the economy is too low, then the given level of output, namely the given level of employment and the given level of consumption, can be well below what is ideal. In his own words, the difficulties in the way of maintaining effective demand at a level high enough to provide full employment, which ensue from the association of a conventional and fairly stable long-term rate of interest with a fickle and highly unstable marginal efficiency of capital, should, by now, be obvious to the reader. He takes this discussion even further, emphasizing that because individual entrepreneurs and capitalists generally don't have a high enough propensity to invest in order to ensure full employment, it falls into the hands of the government to ensure that our economic system can guarantee full employment for all citizens. In his own words, in conditions of laissez-faire, the avoidance of wide fluctuations in employment may, therefore, prove impossible without a far-reaching change in the psychology of investment markets, such as there is no reason to expect. I conclude that the duty of ordering the current volume of investments cannot safely be left in private hands. Now, what this is saying, stripped of jargon, is this. If we want to live in a world where everyone can have a job, then the government is going to play a vital role in that transformation. There is quite simply no reason to assume that what is individually advantageous for individual entrepreneurs, capitalists, and investors is going to be what is desirable or beneficial for everybody. On the one hand, a given level of full employment, and in the wider sense, an economy that is making full use of all of its productive resources. So Keynes' criticism, which it should be worthwhile to recall, founded the modern discipline of macroeconomics, causes us to ask another different question. Who is opposed to this policy? After all, under a regime of full employment, workers benefit from the fact that they know that they'll never be involuntarily unemployed. Business owners know that they'll have much more dynamic markets with which to invest in order to draw demand from. And governments are able to consistently smooth out the business cycle and ensure more equitable long-term growth. In order to answer this next question, we have to turn to the second major thinker that I mentioned, Michel Kalecki. Michel Kalecki was a Polish emigre to Britain who was invited to come to the country by Keynes and eventually took up a position at Cambridge University. Kalecki married the insights of both Keynes as well as another major political economist who has a very important bit to add to the question of full employment, Karl Marx. Perhaps the most important essay that Kalecki penned over the course of his career was one written during the very depths of World War II, written in 1943, known as The Political Aspects of Full Employment. The question Kalecki sought to answer was the very one that I've originally posed. Who would stand against a policy of full employment, given the obvious benefits that can be seen across the economy? The answer, as Kalecki gives, is the capitalist class. Kalecki wanted to draw attention to something that isn't easily able to be found in your average macroeconomics textbook. One could say it lies beyond the simple supply and demand curve. What Kalecki was concerned to discuss was the coercive element in capitalist society. You see, in a system of full employment, where workers are guaranteed employment, and where they know that they can go elsewhere, they have a lot stronger incentives to form into labor unions and confront management to ask for better hours, better pay, and better working conditions. This is unquestionably beneficial to the wider society, and it benefits the workforce, but it is also undeniably the case that it would be a disaster for the capitalist class. As a result of this, Kalecki's point is to say simply, unemployment may not be socially desirable, it may not be ethically desirable, and it is certainly economically inefficient. But if you're a business person, the fear that you can strike into your workforce, if they know that they can't simply get a job elsewhere, is much more valuable than any potential bottom line. And Kalecki, in his own words, said this very point quite explicitly. Under a regime of permanent full employment, the sack will cease to play its role as a disciplinary measure. The social position of the boss would be undermined, and the self-assurance and class consciousness of the working class would grow. Strikes for wage increases and improvements in condition of work would create political tension. It is true that profits would be higher under a regime of full employment than they are on average under laissez-faire. In other words, things would be better off for everyone, including the business owners, from a strictly economic perspective. But discipline in the factories and political stability are more appreciated than profits by business leaders. Their class instinct tells them that lasting full employment is unsound from their point of view, and that unemployment is an integral part of the normal capitalist system. This is an earth-shattering thing to consider in light of our present economic system. When major figures in the Democratic Party, and certainly left-wing leaders further afield, are pointing out that full employment is not only ethical but economical, what Kalecki is telling us, borrowing the insights from Keynes and Marx, is that these elements will be resisted not because they're inefficient, and not because they can't be maintained, but because the present economic system will violently resist it by any means necessary. Now, it's important to keep in mind the time in which Kalecki was writing. The political aspects of full employment originally came out in 1943, during the height of the war economy. What he predicted in this short and insightful essay was that eventually the regime of full employment would come to be undermined, as business owners refused to invest in an economy where they couldn't have more effective control over the workforce. This is in fact exactly what happened roughly 30 years later, during the height of both the OPEC crisis as well as the height of the stagflation crisis that occurred throughout the Western world in the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. As one might expect, in Britain and the United States, under Thatcher and Reagan respectively, the system of full employment was undermined by those leaders, who sought to instead transform the economy from one in which full employment was a right into which employment itself was a struggle. This is the takeaway from the modern economic lessons which are given to us by Keynes and Kalecki. So that's the intellectual background. But what's the lessons for the present? Currently, some politicians, still precious few today, and an increasingly large social movement is rallying around the cry of full employment as the first demand for a more just economic system. They are right to do so. Full employment is an ethical as well as an economical imperative for the present age. We face earth-shatteringly difficult challenges ahead of us. Climate change, rising inequality, and other major international phenomena are going to demand a United States that is able to robustly respond to these challenges. And we can't do so if we continue to indulge in the petty rhetoric of rising profits and rising inequality coming at the direct cost of secure and stable employment for the American people. But turning that possibility into a reality requires all of us, and not just a handful of intellectuals writing so many years ago. I'll leave you with these closing words from Kalecki's famous essay. Full employment capitalism will, of course, have to develop new social and political institutions which will reflect the increased power of the working class. If capitalism can adjust itself to full employment, a fundamental reform will have been incorporated in it. If not, it will show itself an outmoded system which must be scrapped. Hey guys, so if you liked the video, feel free to smash the like and subscribe button. I'm always happy to hear about the comments that you have on these, and we're really enjoying the work that we're doing here. So by all means, if you have comments, criticisms, if you want us to cover other topics, feel free to reach out. And thanks again for watching.